What if the faces you think you know from history were carefully manufactured illusions? What if kings and queens weren't just ruling nations, but controlling how their faces would survive for centuries? Portraits were propaganda. Copies replaced originals, artists flattered, enemies distorted. And over time, repetition became truth. Before we peel back the layers of paint and power, subscribe and like this video. If you're fascinated by myth-busting history, hidden manipulation, and the secrets behind royal images, you're in the right place. And I promise, some of what you're about to see will challenge the version of history you thought was settled. Now tell me in the comments, which of Henry VIII's wives do you think history has misrepresented the most? Catherine? Anne? Someone else? Let's see if the evidence changes your mind. Forget the movie versions. The faces you think you know were often staged, copied, or invented. I went back to the physical evidence: medals, miniatures, Holbein sketches, later copies, ambassador reports, and the occasional authenticated miniature, and built a running account of what their faces probably looked like. I'll flag what's certain, what's disputed, and what's pure inference. By the end, you'll see how portraits, politics, and fashion together rewrote the look of Henry VIII and his 6 queens, and why history lied to you is less a conspiracy and more an artifact of how power wants to be seen. Catherine of Aragon has been boxed into a simple stereotype: Spanish, dark-haired, severe, the implacable Catholic queen. That image rests on a handful of later portraits, and on the way Tudor royal portraiture recycled visual types, not on a single, unambiguous likeness from her own youth. Here's the problem. We have works attributed to Citeaux and a set of Hornbout miniatures that scholars treat as among our best visual clues, but different images point in very different directions. The Citeaux portrait that some scholars identify as a young Catherine shows a face with a rounded jaw, fair skin, and reddish tones in the hair, features that overlap with portraits of her sister Juana of Castile and with contemporary descriptions of Spanish Habsburg coloring. Meanwhile, a Hornbout miniature often linked to Catherine, likely painted during or soon after her arrival at the English court, presents a woman whose hair and complexion rid lighter than the dark-haired stereotype. Complicating matters, a group of portraits historically labelled as Catherine were actually workshop products or later copies that borrowed facial types from other sitters. Reconstruction A, based on the Citeaux attributed portrait and sibling likenesses, leans toward a young woman with pale skin, a rounded face and auburn to red hair, with blue or grey eyes, suggested by the cooler tones in several miniatures. Reconstruction B, based on the confirmed Hornbout miniatures and a midlife workshop portrait, depicts an older Catherine with the same fair complexion but subtly different facial proportions. A slightly broader nose and a firm mouth shaped by years of court life. Primary sources: Citeaux attributed portrait, likely early life; Hornbout miniatures, contemporary; later Tudor workshop copies. Degree of certainty: likely but not definitive. The identifications are plausible and supported by sibling comparisons and early miniatures, yet several portraits remain disputed. Takeaway: Catherine's look was probably lighter and more florid than the dark Spaniard caricature suggests. Portraits vary because artists, reproductions, and court fashions all reshaped her image. Up next, the Queen Hollywood loves to reduce to a dark temptress. Was Anne Boleyn really the exotic seductress her legends claim? Anne Boleyn's face lives in contradiction. Popular imagination has fixed on a dark, mysterious beauty, but the visual evidence from her lifetime is surprisingly thin. There is no verified painted portrait of Anne by Holbein done while she lived. Instead, we rely on a battered coin-like medal, a handful of miniatures of contested provenance, Holbein's surviving sketches for court-sitters, and later portraits that claim to preserve her likeness. One of the most discussed objects is a small Tudor medallion that bears a profile and the inscription usually read as Anne's name. It shows a pronounced nose and a high forehead, elements that recur in later engravings and theatrical depictions. The so-called Lumley portrait, a later oil portrait once attributed to a contemporary hand and photographed in the early 20th century, has a complicated provenance and may be a later pastiche rather than a direct testimony.
Holbein's surviving preparatory drawing that is linked to Anne is fragmentary and does not provide an unambiguous match to later popular images. Reconstruction A, based on the medal and Holbein linked drawing, interprets Anne as having an elegant, slightly elongated face, a prominent nose and large, expressive eyes.
Hair color on this reconstruction is rendered as dark brown with possible auburn highlights, because contemporary notes suggest a darker complexion, but family genetics make auburn plausible. Reconstruction B, taking the Lumley portrait and some early copies into account, presents a slightly softer-featured woman with a longer neck and a less angular nose. This version leans toward a darker, browner hair color but remains speculative. Primary sources: the Anne Boleyn medal, contemporary but stylized; Holbein preparatory drawings, linked by association; the Lumley portrait, disputed provenance; later copies. Degree of certainty: high uncertainty. No universally accepted lifetime portrait survives. Reconstructions remain interpretive. Takeaway: Anne's dark siren image is more a later literary and theatrical construction than a tightly evidenced portrait. The real woman probably had distinct, somewhat masculine features that made her memorable at court without necessarily fitting modern beauty tropes. Now, before we move on, a quick word from the sponsor, who helps me keep the lights on and the research rolling. I've been taking AG1 daily for months. It's a simple way to cover basic nutrition when you're juggling long research days and late-night edits. I like that it mixes protein and essentials in a form that's easy to use when I'm on the road to archives. If you want to try it, check the link in the description. It helps the channel when you do. Thanks. Now back to portraiture. Jane Seymour is where we finally touch a relatively stable visual record. Holbein painted her, and among Tudor wives, she's one of the better attested sitters. The famous portrait type we associate with Jane, the gable hood, the modest blackwork sleeve, the soft oval face, reads as Holbein's sober, unromantic finesse. A woman presented in a way that emphasizes lineage and fertility rather than dramatic individuality. Reconstruction, based primarily on Holbein's portrait and associated workshop copies, presents Jane as understated and symmetrical: medium fair skin, an oval face, a straight nose, and a cool, composed expression. Holbein's attention to costume and proportions gives us some confidence that this is a close likeness. Fashion masks as much as it reveals, but his sitters were usually painted from life and with excellent draftsmanship. Primary sources: Holbein portrait, confirmed sitter, workshop copies. Degree of certainty: relatively high compared with other wives, because we have Holbein's hand and consistent workshop replicas. Takeaway: Jane's visual legacy is less about theatrical romance and more about Holbein's measured portraiture. She likely looked like the composed, unobtrusive queen the painting presents. Anne of Cleves is perhaps the most famous example of how visual evidence, politics, and the monarch's mood can produce a myth. Henry famously called her unattractive shortly after he saw Holbein's official portrait. The resulting divorce has been cited for centuries as proof that Holbein lied or that Anne was plain. That's too neat. Holbein's portrait, sent to England, shows a composed, full-featured German noblewoman in courtly dress. Barthel-Broin's three-quarter view and other northern portraits offer alternative angles that suggest a different face from Holbein's frontal state portrait. Here's what matters: 16th century ideals of beauty varied across courts. Holbein's role as diplomatic artist meant he sometimes emphasized certain features to flatter or to clarify status. Broin's more intimate three-quarter view gives us depth of plane and indicates a woman of solid bone structure, broad features, and a dignified presence rather than caricature. Henry's failing health, unrealistic expectations about youthful eroticism, and political friction all contributed to the ugly story, not solely any objective facial deficiency. Reconstruction A, based on Holbein's official portrait, depicts Anne as dignified and broad-faced, with strong jaw lines and clear, cool eyes. Reconstruction B, leaning on Broyne and other northern portraits, shows a woman with a slightly longer face and a broader nose, features that read as striking in a way that English courtly taste might have misunderstood. Both reconstructions avoid sensational adjectives. They place Anne as an accomplished, dignified duchess who did not match Henry's idealized expectations. Primary sources: Holbein's diplomatic portrait, high profile sent to England, Barthel Broyne, three-quarter view, and related German portraits. Degree of certainty: likely in general facial architecture, but exact details vary by source. Takeaway: Anne's so-called ugliness is a myth born from a collision of expectation and politics. Artists recorded her as a capable, dignified woman, not a joke. Catherine Howard's portrait record is frustratingly thin. Executed before she had a public queenly presence, she left few contemporaneous images that can be securely linked to her. Several candidate portraits circulate: a miniature sometimes associated with the royal necklace, and a Metropolitan Museum candidate that some scholars suggest could be Catherine. But these attributions are contested and often rest on circumstantial costume or later labeling. Because of that scarcity, I'll present two hypothetical reconstructions tied to different candidate sitters. Reconstruction A takes a miniature with courtly jewelry and a hairstyle consistent with early Tudor youth, producing a portrait of a lively, rounded-faced young woman with bright eyes. Reconstruction B uses a different proposed candidate portrait that implies a slightly longer face and a softer chin. The point is not to claim either as definitive. Both are explicit hypotheses, grounded in the best but slender visual clues and in contemporary descriptions of Catherine as vivacious and young. Primary sources: a small number of disputed miniatures and later labelled portraits, some with royal jewellery added in later centuries. Degree of certainty: high uncertainty. Attributions are tentative and should be treated as possible rather than proven. Takeaway: Catherine's image has been largely lost to time. Reconstructions are valuable for imagining, not for asserting her true look. Catherine Parr is one of the more securely identifiable queens thanks to jewellery motifs and consistent portrait types that match documentary wardrobe records. A handful of paintings attributed to the so-called Master John or his circle show a woman with keen eyes, a narrow face, and a distinctive crown-shaped jewel that appears in inventory lists tied to the Queen. Those consistent elements across multiple portraits give us a firmer basis for reconstruction. Reconstruction, based on these Master John-style portraits and on descriptions from contemporaries, suggests a tallish, fair woman with sharp, alert eyes, a pointed chin, and a composed, scholarly demeanour that aligns with her reputation as a learned and influential queen. The jewellery detail, especially the crown-shaped jewel, helps anchor identifications and raises our confidence. Primary sources: Master John-style portraits, consistent costume and jewellery, wardrobe and inventory records. Degree of certainty: relatively high, because portrait motifs align with documentary evidence. Takeaway: Catherine Parr's portraits convey her intellectual presence and status. Unlike some other wives, we can be reasonably confident her painted likeness approximates her appearance. Before we get to the king himself, pause on a broader pattern. Artists and courts had tools for shaping identity. Holbein could flatter or formalize depending on the diplomatic need. Miniatures compressed detail and often served as tokens rather than faithful likenesses. Medals simplified profiles into emblematic faces. Costume: the gable hood, the French hood, jewels often masked or emphasized features. And political motives: diplomacy, marriage negotiation,
Propaganda pressured painters to produce images that served a purpose beyond out-and-out veracity.
So what about Henry VIII? The king's own image is a study in transformation. Contemporary English descriptions of his youth praise an athletic figure and reddish hair. Ambassadors called him commanding and handsome. Early portraits and Jus Van Cleve's images of young Henry suggest a vigorous, square-jawed prince with auburn hair, someone who fit Renaissance ideals of aristocratic vigor. After his fall from jousting in the 1530s, injuries, infections, and the passage of time altered his body and probably his face. But Henry's court was also an expert in image management. Later official portraits, many by Holbein's workshop and later copyists, idealize him into symbolism, the powerful monarch as ruler-in-chief, cloaked in sumptuous fabrics and projecting controlled majesty. Reconstruction. Young Henry, based on early Holbein sketches and Jus Van Cleve-type images, presents a lean, muscular noble with auburn hair, a high forehead, and an upright carriage. Reconstruction. Older Henry, based on Holbein's later full-length state portraits and on surviving copies used as propaganda, shows a broad, imposing man whose physical bulk and paler hair reflect later life, but whose facial features in portraiture were often softened or intensified to communicate authority rather than to record aging honestly. Primary sources: early Holbein sketches and Jus Van Cleve-type portraits for youth, Holbein's state portraits and later copies for the mature king. Degree of certainty: generally high that Henry changed from athletic youth to a heavier, older monarch, and that many images are politicized. Precise facial detail in later portraits is shaped by propaganda. Takeaway: Henry's visual arc is as important as his political one. Portraits document a deliberate rewriting of royal identity from handsome prince to emblematic sovereign. Across these profiles you should already see the pattern I've insisted on. Portraits are tools with multiple functions. Sometimes they record, more often they mediate, between artist and sitter, between court and public, between historical moment and later memory. That's why every reconstruction I've presented includes furniture that supports or undermines identity claims. Medals supply profile geometry, miniatures preserve hair and eye hints, Holbein's draftsmanship gives us measured physiognomy, and documentary inventories sometimes name specific jewels that recur across portraits and help anchor identifications. As a quick visual thought experiment, a modern-day reimagining, imagine Catherine of Aragon as a woman in her 30s today, with pale skin, warm auburn hair pulled into a low bun, wearing a high-collared jacket that echoes a gable hood. Picture Anne Boleyn as a striking angular woman, with clever eyes and a controlled smile, her hair dark but with possible reddish highlights under certain light. See Jane Seymour in a plain, elegant blouse that reframes her symmetry and restraint as intelligence rather than blandness. Envision Anne of Cleves as a dignified, northern-featured woman in a stately coat, her presence more sober than comic. Let Catherine Howard read as bright and youthful in a cropped modern jacket, ephemeral and lively. Catherine Parr becomes the intellectual stylish in spectral tailored clothes with a crown-shaped brooch as her signature. And Henry. Flip a before and after portrait into a cinematic transformation. The athletic young man morphing into a powerhouse whose image was carefully curated when his body stopped conforming to youth. We should be clear. None of these are the one true face. They are plausible, evidence-informed interpretations based on the best surviving material, and they always carry degrees of uncertainty. Where a portrait's attribution is disputed, I've said so. Where multiple sources conflict, I've offered alternative reconstructions and explained why different artists might present different results. If one final lesson emerges, it's this. Images are arguments. A medal argues for emblem, a miniature argues for intimacy, a state portrait argues for power. Reading them together, medals, miniatures, Holbein's hand, later copies, ambassador commentary, wardrobe lists, gives us a more textured, respectful sense of the people behind the headlines. They were complex, aging, strategic, and human. The lies of history are rarely intentional conspiracies. They're accumulations of choices by artists, courtiers, and collectors who shaped how later generations remember a face. If one reconstruction surprised you, say which in the comments: Anne's mystique, Catherine of Aragon's likely fair coloring, or the rehabilitation of Anne of Cleves. Like the video if you enjoyed this evidence-led tour, and subscribe for the next deep dive where we'll unpack one of these faces in forensic detail. Thanks for watching, and for letting the portraits speak a little more clearly.